Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Thersites' Politics After Dark. This week, we're delving into the dark, dank world of propaganda, especially propaganda swirling about Hillary Clinton. Last time, we looked at a book which effectively tried to sell Hillary to a younger generation going into the 2016 cycle. This time, we backtrack about half a year to when that cycle was just beginning and when the primary race was just heating up, and we look at a book which attempts to really make Hillary seem like someone who should not be considered for office because she is uniquely and horrifically corrupt. This book is by Peter Schweizer, and the title is Clinton Cash, The Untold Story of How and Why Foreign Governments and Businesses Made Bill and Hillary Rich. I had never actually heard of Peter Schweizer before this, at least not that I can recall. I'm sure I have seen him once or twice because apparently he is a very common guest on every right-wing news network, and I usually have to encounter Fox News a fair amount when I visit family or go to certain public places, and also a lot of times I'll see clips for various reasons, but he looks familiar, but then again he does have the kind of face that you see on a number of people. I have learned more about him since for this project, so he's no longer a mystery to me. Well, I figured this is going to be pretty rank propaganda, it's going to be pretty vague, and it's going to rely very heavily on insinuation. I was mostly right, but I do have to say that much like with my initial assessment of Cynthia Levinson's biography of Hillary, I did underestimate the author to some extent. Peter Schweizer is a fairly good writer. He writes with a lot of clarity, and in certain segments he sounds like someone who is pretty objective and has good influence. I've also seen interviews with him. He's very well-spoken, and he's well-spoken enough that it's to the point where he does not belong on Fox News. He seems out of place. So, but anyway, he also is pretty good at describing accurately and with detail how influence peddling works. So he's someone who fully understands modern corruption. So how campaign contributions can really pervert the way that people vote. And to that extent, when he's describing that, in some cases, he sounds like a more articulate Cenk Uygur. Because Cenk Uygur, coming from a very different perspective, also describes campaign contributions and their corrupting influence in about the same way. So actually I was pretty impressed by his description of that, because that's something that you don't really hear a lot from people on the right. Most of them have no concern whatsoever with things like campaign finance or with corruption as a process. So they might say, in general, someone is corrupt, but then not explain it. This is the explanation. And he does a pretty damn good job of explaining precisely why the Clintons are corrupt. And he also gives some pretty good examples at times. However, a lot of the quality of that argument is taken down by the fact that he goes from accurate descriptions of how it works and how they've done it over a period of time to then getting sidetracked. And I assume part of it is he didn't have enough material. So he probably rushed this book out to meet a deadline. And so there are signs of the book starting to unravel as you move along. This is not a super long book, by the way. But once you get into that last 20 or 30%, it starts to get rough. And then he starts to go into examples that don't really help his central thesis. So, for instance, some of the stories come across as incredibly hacky. He talks about the Clinton Global Initiative being involved in especially countries in Africa. And so, if you know anything about the politics of, say, the Congo or some of the other countries that the Clintons were dealing with, you know that there's a lot of corruption, and any money you send there, somebody's going to have their hand in the cookie jar. That's just a given. It doesn't necessarily negate the quality of what happened or necessarily mean that the Clintons completely screwed up. Now, it's possible that they did, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they of necessity did. Now, the example from the Congo that was especially egregious is that the Clintons worked with a native of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Dikembe Mutombo, the former NBA player, who is one of the more prominent citizens there, in order to help bring some aid to the country. And then one of Dikembe Mutombo's maybe nephews or some other associate of Dikembe was involved in helping to smuggle gold on a private plane. And I don't know if the person with the private plane was directly linked to the Clintons or had known them at some point, but there was a very loose connection there. Anyway, the point is that he's trying to portray this as, well, somebody kind of associated with the Clintons through this one interaction they had among however many was involved in stealing gold from the Congo. Again, it's not a great argument. The better parts of the writing are when he's talking about the paid speeches and when he could show the dates for how Hillary became Secretary of State, and then while the country is negotiating with whatever country, that country will for the first time hire Bill Clinton for hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a paid speech. So those parts of the book work really well. And again, that shows influence peddling, and this guy has a pretty good grasp of how influence peddling works, and then he does hacky shit that just takes away from the quality of that. So it'd be better to have a shorter book that is more cohesive and where the examples actually work, because when he gets into these other examples, it just becomes apparent that he's a partisan hack Republican, and that by definition, everything the Clintons do is wrong, and everything that the Republicans do is not as bad. Now, this, again, is not necessarily a horrible book. There actually are things you can learn from it, legitimate knowledge here. What I don't appreciate about this book as much is, again, that it doesn't stick with its main themes very well. And then when I learned about Peter Schweizer, unfortunately, that's an example of the artist making me really doubt the value of the art, because Peter Schweizer is far more hacky than this book would lead you to believe if you just read this in isolation. And in fact, over the last decade, you would think that he would turn this same criteria of what corruption is and look at some of the Republicans. And he does mention a few Republicans here and there as being corrupt, or he'll say the Republicans do stuff like this too. Currently, we have literally the most corrupt president in American history, Donald Trump. And so far as I can tell, Peter Schweizer has never critiqued him for corruption. In fact, he's gone out of his way to avoid that conversation altogether, because he did in the Biden years go after Joe Biden heavily. He was a featured guest who would describe Joe Biden's corruption and Hunter Biden's corruption with, was it Burisma Energy? Well, today, his new fear-mongering is not about corruption, because that would require him to talk about Trump, which is obviously not going to work. Instead, he is talking about immigration and still doing the idea that foreign governments are behind immigration. So a combination of liberals and foreign governments are behind immigration, and they're doing it to somehow weaken America. So this is a guy who is clearly playing to the Republican base. He's a total shill. He's a performer. And it's really a shame, because this is a guy who is intelligent, can write, and could be doing quality work. He could be informing people in a way that makes our society better, that makes our democracy more informed. And instead, he's choosing to engage as a propagandist in order to make the country more ignorant. And for that reason, I have no respect for this man, and I will shed no tears when he passes away. So fuck you, Peter Schweizer, and fuck everything you've ever written, you hack motherfucker. Anyway, that concludes our week of propaganda. There are other books I'll be reviewing in the future, some of which are even worse than this. And I'm trying to work ahead right now and get through a lot of these tonight, so my pain and suffering has only just started. Alright, well, next week we'll have a different theme. We'll be looking at different books by different people. Maybe we'll even be doing different activities. I don't know yet. Anyhow, that's all for now. Peace out, everybody. Thersites' Politics After Dark, signing out.